Well, good afternoon from Washington, D.C., and welcome to Baker Hostetler's 2020 Election Update webinar. We are excited to have you join us today for this important discussion. We are 35 days out from Election Day and only hours away from the first presidential debate this evening. Again, welcome. I'm former Congressman Mike Ferguson. I lead Baker Hostetler's federal policy team in Washington, D.C. I'm very pleased to be joined, as always, by my former colleague in the House, my current colleague here at Baker Hostetler, former Congressman Heath Shuler. Heath, great to be with you again. This is going to be fun today. I think you're there, Heath. Maybe you're on mute.
Yes, we talked about offline about how awesome, seeing all the ads that's coming on, and certainly being in North Carolina, you get to see every political ad imaginable just right here in the state of North Carolina, because it's such in play. So it's going to be a very interesting, the next 35 days, certainly after this first debate. It's going to be, I think, getting, the polls will always narrow, getting closer to the end. So it's going to be exciting. Looking forward to hearing the conversation.
Heath, I know if you're like me, I know you remember these what it's like to have your name on the ballot, to be 35 days out from an election. Life just gets crazier and crazier. We remember those days when we were running for our elections and re-elections, but gosh, you obviously, your home state, North Carolina, really in the center of things, one of a handful of states that's center of the presidential race, you got a big Senate race, you got House races going on, a lot going on in North Carolina and a number of other states. So we're excited to get to that conversation today. It's going to be a lot of fun. For our listeners, Baker Hostetler is a 104-year-old law firm. We were founded in Cleveland, Ohio, which is a pretty exciting place to be today. It's where the presidential debate is going to happen tonight. And now we have our headquarters in Washington, D.C. We have close to 1,000 lawyers and 17 offices around the country. We have legal expertise in a whole range of specialties, from antitrust, healthcare, energy, mergers and acquisitions, complex commercial litigation, data privacy and security, patent prosecution, tax, a lot more. Got a lot of different expertise here at our firm at Baker Hostetler. I mentioned that I lead our firm's federal policy team, where Heath and I work together with our colleagues on our team. We provide our clients with government affairs consulting services. That means our bipartisan team, which includes veterans from Capitol Hill and the executive branch. We help our clients navigate Washington. We connect the dots and help shape policy outcomes to meet our clients' strategic and business goals. Today, we are really pleased to be joined by Jim Ellis. Jim is a longtime friend of Heath's and mine. He's also a longtime friend of Baker Hostetler. He has spent more than 35 years in politics. First, he practiced it. Now he's analyzing it for his own firm, Ellis Insight, as well as doing work with BIPAC, the Business and Industry Political Activity Action Committee. They advise corporate clients on policy and politics, and on political action committee strategies. Jim's also been a regular speaker at our firm, Baker Hostetler's annual legislative seminars here in Washington. Jim, thanks for joining us. Delighted to have you along with us again today.
Well, Mike and Heath, thank you very much for inviting me again. It's always a pleasure to be with you all, especially 35 days before the election. It's really going to be crazy. And we're, as you all said, it's 35 days before the election, but probably 65 before we know who wins.
That's one of the things we want to talk about here today. Everybody keeps talking about election day, and I hear more and more people talking about election season, because it might not be all settled in a day, as we're learning as we get closer and closer to that day. So why don't we dive right in? Here we are. We're 35 days from Election Day. Voters have already started casting their ballots in a number of states. We've got the White House up for grabs this year. We have maybe Senate, control of the U.S. Senate up for grabs this year. Let's start first, though, with the presidential race. So when we're looking at the 2020 presidential race, probably best to start, by looking at the how the Electoral College finished 4 years ago. What were those results? And because that's going to sort of form a baseline for this year's race, it's important to maybe take a look at that first. So although President Trump won the Electoral College, I guess pretty handily in 2016, if you just look at the numbers, several of those states he won very, very narrowly. He made, it made the actual race much closer than maybe what the actual numbers in the Electoral College results showed. So if we're looking at this map, the 2016 map, we think about the states both that the Trump campaign and the Biden campaign this year are targeting. 2020 in some ways looks a lot like 2016. So Jim, let's focus on first on the race from the president's perspective, since he's the one seeking re-election. He's the incumbent. When you look at the 2020 campaign, you say, Jim, that it's really a two-step process from President Trump's perspective. The first step is what you call Trump's core five states. Walk us through that. Talk to us about that.
Yes, I think these are the five most important states really to look for the outcome of the election, because President Trump has to carry all five of these: Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina. And as we all know, Florida and North Carolina are always swing states, and either party can win any statewide election, although Republicans tend to win a few more than Democrats in both those places. And Georgia, Texas, and Arizona have been in the past slam dunk Republican states that are now much closer to the political center, and particularly in the case of Arizona, are much more competitive. Whereas before, they were like New York, New Jersey, and California for a Democratic candidate. And those states are certainly the same way they are for Joe Biden, where he starts off with 98 electoral votes from those three states right in his pocket. That's why these five are so important for Trump or any Republican presidential candidate to carry them all, because it really sets up the rest of that map. And all these states right now are polling pretty close. I think Arizona is, as I said before, is his biggest problem at this point, but he is gaining there. The Florida numbers are coming back. North Carolina, we were talking in our pre-call, that's right in terms of an even race right now, but it typically is at this point in time right before an election. And Georgia and Texas, I think, probably still stay Republican, but they are certainly more competitive. So we have a different map in that regard in terms of how the politics has changed around the country. But you're right, Mike, most of the states are the same ones that were in play in 2016. And again, I think that's why these five are so critically important. So on watching on election night, if President Trump does not carry all five of these, I think Joe Biden wins the race. So if you're in the Biden campaign, cracking through any one of these five probably allows you to win the national election.
So Heath, you're the Tar Heel here, or the North Carolinian. What this is funny because usually, a lot of folks around the country are used to looking at swing states. Florida, of course, from the Bush v. Gore situation 20 years ago. But these aren't the states that people are usually focused on, with the exception of Florida. And now I think North Carolina more. Heath, what are you feeling on the ground in North Carolina?
I think from the presidential standpoint, I think it's truly neck and neck. The polls, all the polls that you see is extremely close. They're all within the margin of error. You may have one candidate above the other one, only 1 or 2 points, but I think it's going to be who can get the vote out. And it's going to be very interesting to see. In this state, the Republicans are hosting events. They're still doing rallies, they're hosting events, and the Democrats are only hosting events online. So it's going to be very interesting when we look back to the 2020 election in North Carolina and maybe some of the other states, that to see how as we call it in politics, the GOTV, getting out the vote, how that's going to be impactful when one party decided to hold rallies and events and the other party decides not to hold rallies and events, that only do things virtually. So it'll be very interesting to see, and I think it's going to possibly could change dynamics in the future if the Democrats were to say, hey, we didn't have to hold these expensive rallies, we were able to get the vote out. So it'll be interesting looking back come November, December, to look back and see which states, how Democrats and Republicans politics differently during this pandemic.
So Jim, so the president absolutely, in your mind, has to win these 5 states to have any chance of being reelected, and Biden, if he just wins one of these, will win the race. Is that your estimation?
I believe that's the case. Yes, I believe that's the case, because really, if let's take Arizona for example, and the Trump campaign is saying, well, they have 7 different ways to put together an electoral college coalition to get them to 270, and I don't buy that. I think they've got one way, and I think this is it. And because a lot of their calculations count, well, if we don't win Florida, we can make it up in other states. If we don't win Arizona, we can make it up in another state. If they don't win these states, the chances of them making a win in a state that is less conservative than these, I think is just a misnomer. And I think that's why I think these 5 are so important. And this also assumes he doesn't have any leakage in Ohio or Iowa, and I don't think he will. And the other ones for Biden's standpoint, New Hampshire and Nevada, may be causing him some problems. But I think all those 4 probably remain with their party. But if we go to the next slide, then we see how important these states are, because they set up the rest of the map. And then we go to the Great Lakes states that the media has paid a lot of attention to, and rightly so, because at least one of these is going to be determinative. But if Trump has all 5 of these states in green, his core states, he only needs any one of the Great Lakes that are all marginal and all are in play, really, and even including Minnesota. He wins any one of those 4 in blue, he wins the presidential election. And that's why those 5 are so critically important. And on the other hand, for Biden, he's got to win them all
So
then.
what happens, say the president loses North Carolina, but maybe wins one of those states in blue? How does that pan out?
Well, they could make up for it. North Carolina has 15 electoral votes. Pennsylvania, for example, has 20. Michigan has 16. So if he won either one of those, then yes, that would make up for North Carolina. But then he'd still have to carry probably both Wisconsin and Minnesota. And that's, again, why those 5 are critical, because he's got to make up 15 and then still take one of the Great Lakes. But in all honesty, if he doesn't win North Carolina, I would have a hard time seeing him win in either Michigan or Pennsylvania.
Yeah, so you're saying he's got to win, President Trump, to win, would have to win his 5 core states that you call them, plus one of those Great Lakes states,
plus
so to
one.
speak.
Right, but only one. Any one of the blue puts him over then. Again, assuming that he doesn't have any leakage in any of the other states. But the rest of them seem pretty solid for both candidates.
Jim, how do you look at, when you look at the races, do you look down ticket? For an example, North Carolina, current governor has a, substantial, some say double-digit lead, was 17 points at one time. Now it's around the 11 or 12 point spread. How do you look at down ticket? And if you even look at the Cal Cunningham and Tom Tillis race, you're starting to see that race is probably going different than most people would have realized early on in the race. But how do you look down ticket? Because oftentimes you're having, if you look at, probably the top 2, Tom Tillis is in a real difficult fight. Cal continues to lead in the polls. So how do you look down ticket, and how does that impact the presidential race kind of up the ticket?
Well, I think greatly, because usually in a situation like this, I would think the turnout model driver is the presidential race. And so when if Trump, for example, carries North Carolina, that's going to be a big plus for Tillis. Whether it's enough to bring him through or not, maybe another story. Although, as you know, North Carolina tends to be a ticket state on the president and Senate, as most states are now. And I think very likely whichever party wins the presidency probably gets the Senate too. And that 50th Senate race for the Democrats could well come down to North Carolina too, as we get into the Senate races. So North Carolina is becoming even more of an important state than it normally is from a national perspective, not only in the presidential race, but also in the Senate. So I think that how the presidential race sets the turnout model will be key for helping the down ballot races on the Republican side, or making it even more difficult for the Democrats to overcome that if Trump wins, and vice versa if Biden were to carry the state.
Well, let's go to the next slide. Jim, another challenge for President Trump, assuming that he can even consolidate his support in his 5 core states, as you describe him. He's, currently leading in only in the +1 states. He's only leading in Michigan by a point. It sounds like he would have to pull sort of an inside straight to pull out a victory here this year. Is that your estimation?
Just like 2016. I mean, he is actually a little touch ahead of at this point in time where he was in 2016 at the beginning of October. And it all fell his way in 2016, and he's going to need to do it again, at least in one of those states. Again, assuming that he holds his core, he doesn't even have to do as well as he did last time. But some of the polling, I see the same patterns as we did in 2016. And in those Great Lakes states, the pollsters were wrong. I mean, for example, in Wisconsin, there was 33 polls done during that election cycle. Trump was ahead in just 1, yet he won the state. Michigan, they ran 45 polls. Trump was ahead in 2, and they had 1 tie, yet he wins. Pennsylvania, 62 polls throughout the election cycle. Trump was ahead 3 times, yet he won. He needs that again. And actually, his numbers are a little bit better at that point in some of those states, particularly like Pennsylvania, than they were 4 years ago at this particular time. Now, whether it breaks that way or not again is potentially another story, and is certainly unwritten at this point. But he is in position to pull it off again. But as we were saying last time, 4 years ago, well, it all has to fall his way for him to win, and then it did. And it looks like that's going to have to happen again for him to pull it off.
So what does Joe Biden need to do then? Let's flip it around. What does Joe Biden need to be focused on right now?
If Biden again can crack into one of those core 5 states in the South, like Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and I think Arizona's his best bet, I think he wins the election, because then it really puts some pressure on Trump in the Great Lakes. But then the map gets pretty hard, actually, for Biden if Trump does carry those 5, because then Biden is forced to run the table in the Great Lakes. So the only way Biden wins then is to carry all 4 of those Great Lakes states. He would have to win Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. He'd have to take all of them. Because remember, as we go back to the electoral vote chart from 2016, Trump can give up 36 electoral votes and still win the election. I know the actual count's a little bit different than what it was on election night, because there were some faithless electors. 5 Hillary Clinton electors did not end up voting for her. Her actual number was 232, and the actual Trump number was 306. But we had some faithless electors in the 21 states that don't bind their electors. And so the actual vote count was a little bit less than we saw on election night. But using the election night count, Trump can give up 36 votes and still win. And that means he can give up Pennsylvania and Michigan both and still win, as long as he carries Wisconsin or steals back Minnesota from them. So that's where it gets tougher for Biden. And again, I come back to those 5 core states in the South and how important they are. And that's why if Biden cracks through in the South in one of those states, again, say Arizona, I think he cracks the map wide open and wins the national election. Otherwise, he's going to have to run the table in the Great Lakes.
So, Jim, we're talking about polling. We're talking about the maybe the unpredictability or the inaccuracy 4 years ago of some of the polls. You talked about dozens of polls during the campaign that had, Clinton winning in some of these states, and then Trump ends up winning the state. For those of us who've been looking at polling and looking at races for years and years and years, you say, well, that was a function of turnout. Which side turned out, their voters better? This year you have to think about that again. Okay, are these polls going to be accurate, or are these polls going to be wrong in some cases because of how turnout was affected? Who, like Heath was saying before, who's turning out their voters? Who is more motivated? we've got, this situation of the last several days with, it's been dominating the news coverage, the Supreme Court opening, a lot of different discussion I've seen about how does this impact the race? Does it, whose voters does it energize? What are your thoughts on that at this point? How is the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett, Judge Barrett, to this Supreme Court opening? How do you think that impacts this turnout, and how it might impact some of the polls that we're looking at right now?
Well, I think greatly in terms, and I'm a little bit surprised. I definitely want to hear what you, Mike, and Heath have to say on this. I think this could be a real boon to the Republicans if they handle it right, because and I think more so in the Senate race possibly than in the presidential race, because if you look at the states that are most in play in the Senate, they are mostly conservative or right of center states. And to me, and so far I haven't seen them doing this yet in the campaigns, and I'm a little bit surprised. I think the mover issue for low propensity Republican voters, and that's what we're talking about to get them motivated to come out, is the Second Amendment or gun control, particularly in places like Montana, Iowa, Arizona to an extent. Those races that they need to turn around, and Heath, I think in North Carolina too, the gun control issue, Second Amendment, I think is a driver for the Republicans. Now, so far in what I've seen since the Barrett nomination, I haven't seen much on that, which has surprised me, because I think it's been known for some time that's the one issue right now. Not as much abortion anymore, but it's more the gun issue that tends to move that low propensity Republican voter to go to the polls. So I think if it's played right, it helps the Republican Senate candidates in a lot of those states.
Jim, I think you're right. I think one of the things that the Democrats would have to be very, mindful of during a lot of these debates, that they don't start. It's going to be difficult for the Democrats to ever even come close to stopping this. So they need to be very careful how they go through this process, the senators, that they don't say things that can be used, for, one senator that's in a very safe state, that's not ultimately going to be used against Biden and or the Senate's in the close races, be used against them based upon the Democrat messaging during these hearings.
Yes, and it really, when the hearings start, I believe it's on the 14th of October, we could see the campaigns change on that. And I think probably the greatest beneficiary of this politically is Lindsey Graham down in South Carolina, where he's in a tough race. He's going to be controlling those hearings. He's going to be controlling the agenda. And this would go a long way for him to be able to rebound. He's in an even race right now when he shouldn't be. His personal numbers aren't very good, and he's trailing where President Trump is. So he definitely needed something to kind of boost him to get back on a better footing than he has been. And this probably does it for him. So I think right now he may be in position to take most advantage of this.
Yeah, and I think,
but I do think it's going to affect the Senate races more than the presidential.
Yeah, and I think Kamala Harris could be almost a make or break it for the presidency. I mean, depends upon how she handles herself, how she utilizes her time, and I think one of our listeners has talked about will other Dems yield more time for her to be able to get her message out. I would say that she's going to keep on message probably a lot better than some of the other Senate Democrats would. So it probably wouldn't be a bad thing if she maintained at the mic, but not to the point. And I think as we're so many races kind of, they try to appeal to the base. You're in the general election and you're not running in New York or California. You're running in those states that we've continued to discuss, about 10 states that are really toss-up states. That has to be your messaging to those folks, not to your base.
Yes, definitely. And you're right. That is going to be a very interesting point of discussion. And I think it's going to get a lot of attention when Kamala Harris questions Amy Coney Barrett. It actually may turn into the fourth presidential debate, don't you think?
It most certainly can. I mean, and I think this is going to be, it's going to be for probably the first time that the vice president, the nominee for the vice presidency is going to play a huge role in the success and the outcome of the president's race based upon these hearings.
Yes, I fully agree. And it is a game changer. How it changes the game, I think, is still an unwritten story. And we'll see how things transpire. But some of the key Senate races that we've talked about, the members are on the committee, such as Heath. Tom Tillis is on the Judiciary Committee. He'll have the opportunity to participate in that debate and question the nominee, as will Senator Joni Ernst in Iowa, who is also in a tough race for the Republicans.
Yes, and I mean, if you look at and we can kind of now switch over to the Senate races, and the Republicans have a majority by narrow, 53 seats, and I mean, there's so many, in order for them to, to take back, it's not a lot of seats. It only takes a couple of those seats to change the dynamics of the entire policy making if Biden is elected and the Dems win, or it still stays the House. I don't think it's going to change, but I certainly think that it's going to, how the presidency goes, probably, like you said, Jim, the Senate will go.
Yes, I think so at this point. I mean, it's a key race that most people don't talk about, but it's really critical, I think, is the Alabama race. And the fact that the Republicans look to be in position to pick that up with Tommy Tuberville over Senator Doug Jones. And certainly the Supreme Court situation affects that race, since Doug Jones is probably going to vote against the nominee, as he did Justice Kavanaugh, and voted for the Trump impeachment. That pushes the Republican number to 54. And that becomes a big deal then, because then the Democrats then have to recoup a seat to make up for the one they lost. And then they still have to win 3 net seats if Biden is elected and 4 if Trump is elected. So the Alabama seat is very important in the outcome of the Senate races.
Yeah, that's huge, because that makes that mountain that the Democrats need to climb just a little higher. But there's plenty of opportunity to climb that mountain. If you look at this map, that's a lot of defense that Republicans are playing. Jim, how would you rank these, maybe in the order of most likely to flip from Republican to Democrat? I know there's been a lot of drama over these last few months of some races looking like they're going to flip, and then maybe the incumbent makes a little comeback. But how do you think it stands right now, 35 days out?
I think the most likely to flip is Colorado, simply because the state has changed so much since Cory Gardner was elected in 2014. In my opinion, I think Cory Gardner is probably the best campaigner the Republicans have, but that race is likely slipping away from him to John Hickenlooper, the former 2-term governor and presidential candidate, just simply because of the way the state is voting. It's just changed too much, despite Gardner being a strong candidate. We've got the Arizona would be second, where the Democrats have an excellent candidate in the retired astronaut Mark Kelly. He's raised a fortune against the appointed Senator Martha McSally. That one looks pretty good for the Democrats at this point, and has for quite a while. And then Maine. We come down now with Susan Collins, who's been running behind for most of the election cycle. My personal opinion, I think she made a mistake by coming out immediately and saying that she won't vote for the motion to proceed to allow a vote on the Supreme Court nominee. I think that cuts away some of the conservative support that she needs from a group that doesn't particularly trust her anyway. And I would favor the Democrats to probably pick that one up. And then we're coming down to Heath's home state of North Carolina, I think, at the end of the day, which could happen, because I do think Joni Ernst in Iowa and Steve Daines in Montana comes through in the end. Another seat coming into play based on polling is Alaska, with Dr. Al Gross challenging the first-term Senator Dan Sullivan. But the Alaska is probably the most difficult state in the union to poll. And we've seen this pattern before in Alaska, where it's real close right up until Election Day, and then it breaks for the Republicans. I think that'll happen again. But that's another state that could be on the horizon, just like I think Minnesota is an outside chance, because of unrest there and because of changing voting patterns in that state, that that Jason Lewis, the Republican nominee, is not a total, shouldn't totally be discounted against Senator Tina Smith. I mean, he's within 8 to 10 points there right now. So there's still a chance that he might be able to pull that out. So those are some peripheral states, Alaska and Minnesota, maybe to keep your eye on too. And Michigan is another good bet for the Republicans, actually.
Right. Yeah. So we looked at a lot of red states there where Republicans are playing defense this year. The map certainly does not favor them in trying to keep control. But it's not as if there's no opportunity to try to win some seats back for them, and where Democrats have to play a little bit of defense. We talked about Alabama, that you think is a likely flip to Republican this year.
Yes.
But talk a little bit more about Minnesota and Michigan.
Well, you've got Minnesota again. There are some interesting patterns in that Minnesota primary, which was August 11th. As we know, that was the site, Minneapolis, of the George Floyd tragedy. And how does that change the voting patterns there? And I think if you look at that primary with Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, there was an opponent to her in the Democratic primary that was not campaigning from the right by any stretch, campaigning equal to her on the left, but was complaining that she doesn't represent the district well and doesn't come back, and that sort of attack. But he raised $4 million against her, and she spent $4 million, and she wins with 57% of the vote there in the Democratic primary with a very high turnout of 160,000 people. This is on August 11th. And that district is the site of the Floyd situation. That, to me, 43% against her in a primary that way, that told me something. And then you go up to the northwest corner of the state, which is the most Trump district that a Democrat holds, Colin Peterson, who's been around for 30 years. The Republican turnout was 10,000 people higher than Democratic turnout in that primary. That's significant to me. And then the first poll after the primary, the Republican nominee was 10 points ahead. So you see some changing there in that, certainly in the rural area, in the southern part of the state and in the northern part and in the Iron Range. I think you see more Republican votes coming out there. The question is, how do those suburbs around Minneapolis respond to what's been going on and the violence in the city and the Floyd tragedy? And are there some people who don't like Trump that are typical Republican or center voters? Do they come back to the Republican side because of those issues? That's the unanswered question, and that's what we have to monitor the rest of the way. So that's why I think Minnesota may be in play. Michigan is another one. I think the Republicans have a real strong candidate there by the name of John James. He's a manufacturing company owner out of the Detroit area, retired Army Ranger, African-American Republican candidate. Before COVID, he was neck and neck with Senator Gary Peters, the first-term senator from Michigan. After COVID hit and we went into the shutdown, Peters went up by about double digits, and it looked like he was going to pull away. But since things have returned a little bit more to normal, James has come back, and we are seeing polls where he's within 4-0 points differential. And I think that trend is going to continue, and that is absolutely a race to watch as we get close to Election Day.
Jim, how much do you look at where not only the presidential candidates' campaigns are playing in, but the independent expenditures? Do you how much do you look at where the President Trump's obviously there's a wall between the campaign and the independent expenditures. Do you start looking to see where they're playing and kind of get a better feel where the independent expenditures are playing, or do you look at more of the presidential races, campaigns themselves?
Well, I think you have to look at both. And, yes, they have to be independent, but each side can tell where the others are spending. And, some stories come up, whoa, Trump is pulling out of Michigan. He's not going to spend any money on ads there. Well, yeah, but the independent expenditure is. And you see that in a lot of Senate races, too, where the National Committee may not be spending as much as some of the premier independent groups, and vice versa. And so you don't have to coordinate to know what's happening, because all you know, because it's disclosed, who's reserved airtime or media time in these various states, and you can make decisions based upon that. Well, you see independent expenditure group A is spending millions in this race. Well, gee, we don't have to spend as much then. So I think you have those games being played, and you've got to look at both the independent side and the campaign side and the major party side, all three together in its totality to really get a good picture. But I think the thing that's clear, because there's so much money in the process now, is that all these Senate races, both sides have more than enough money to get their message out. Democrats generally have more, but when you get to a certain degree, like $30 million in the state of South Carolina, how much more do you need than that? I mean, that's overkill to begin with. Lindsey Graham is saying, oh, they're going to spend $80 million against me, and that may be true, but how much more does that really get you in terms of once you've delivered that initial message and you've got your turnout set? In a small state like that, I think it's probably overkill. But the bottom line is each side has plenty of money to get their message out.
Yeah, having the upstate South Carolina television area, we get one station in North Carolina and the others are from South Carolina. So every time I watch it on TV, that's the races I'm seeing is the Lindsey Graham and Harrison race. It's unbelievable the amount of money that they're spending.
Yes, and in small markets, I mean that that kind of money dominates the airwaves, and I'm sure the mailboxes are filled too, and people's computers.
Hey Jim, before we go to the House races, which we want to talk about in a second, comment briefly on Georgia. It's a crazy state this year because it's being fought for the presidential race, but there's 2 Senate races going on there. Give our listeners a quick update summary of that.
Well, the Georgia races are interesting, and you know, if we get into a situation where it comes down to that last Georgia special election, we're going to have to wait till January 5th for the outcome of the Senate majority, because that's when that seat will go to its runoff. The second Georgia seat, the seat that Senator Johnny Isakson resigned from due to health reasons at the end of the year, and now appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler is on the ballot. That's a jungle primary on Election Day, November 3rd. So there's 5 major candidates there, 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans. And if no one gets 50%, and that's almost a certainty that no one will get 50% in that group, that the top 2 finishers, regardless of party, will advance to the January 5th runoff. And so assuming that's 1 Democrat and 1 Republican, which is the most likely outcome, but it's possible you get 2 Republicans or 2 Democrats, but less likely 2 Democrats since you've got the incumbent there, even though she's not elected. But so if we're at 50-49 one way or another, or neither side is at 51, then that Senate seat in Georgia on January 5th would likely determine the majority. And it's possible we're in that situation. The other Senate race is Senator David Perdue, first-term senator running for his 2nd term. I think at the end of the day, he's going to be okay. I think actually some of his media spots have been the best I've seen of any race in the country. And he's up a little bit in the polls. I do think there's an undercount for Republicans in Georgia by at least a couple of points, as there is in all the southern states typically. And so I would favor Senator Perdue there. But you know, there's just all kinds of money flowing in Georgia. But that is a great point, Mike, that special election in particular could really upset the apple cart in figuring out who's going to be the majority at the end of the day.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about the calendar in a second and how some of these things might get drawn out. Let's talk about the House for just a moment.
Yeah.
Several key races for both parties. You know, Jim, I think most folks believe the Democrats are unlikely to lose their majority. But how do you think it plays out? Do you think they'll pick up some seats or maybe lose some seats to the Republicans in the House elections?
Well, probably a little bit of both. You know, I think the House cycle is interesting in the fact that we've already had 8 incumbents, 5 Republicans and 3 Democrats, lose their renomination elections, which is a very high number at this point. And I think that's a little bit surprising too, because with COVID, it's a lot harder for all challengers against incumbents because they don't have the community events to go to. It's much harder to do grassroots. As Heath was saying, it's all virtual now in North Carolina from the Democratic side. It's just much more difficult to campaign in a person-to-person context, with a challenger really needs that. And so I would have guessed that we will see less incumbent defeats this time than we have in the past. But then we see the primary overlay, and we see 8 already going down, a very high number so far. And so it's hard to understand really what to make of all of that at this point. The point on the House race is that the Republicans will need a net of 19, because again, we come back to North Carolina. The Supreme Court there changed the map. So the Democrats are going to pick up 2 seats. So numbers-wise, it would show 17, but it's really 19 because the Democrats are getting two seats for sure out of the Republican column. 19 is very possible still. We've had 4 elections since 1994 where the minority party has gained 40 seats or more, including 2018. And you do have 30 Democrats who sit in seats that President Trump won. And they need 19 seats. Now, on the other hand, the Democrats are aggressive in going after Republican incumbents, and I would expect them to pick up some current Republican seats. So yes, I do agree with the analysis that the Democrats most likely hold the House. It might be a little bit of a smaller majority than they currently have. Right now they have 233, they need 218. I'm thinking, maybe 227 to 230 is maybe more likely where they come, because I do think some of this Republican seats that the GOP lost in 2018 that they really probably shouldn't have, in South Carolina and in Ohio, not Ohio, but Oklahoma. Some seats like that, there are 3 or 4 of those that I think do come back. And then if they break even, they gain single digits. That would be my best guess at this point. But I do see a large number of races. I think there's at least 60 campaigns in 32 states where we've got real action going on in the House races. So it gets pretty convoluted, and a lot. I've been the candidates I've met been pretty good crop of candidates for challengers this time. So we could see some upsets.
Jim, do you think that once you look at after the election, if obviously you're thinking that maybe the House could be a little closer based upon so many Democrats holding Trump victory states in which or districts in which he won. Do you think that the Blue Dogs would play a much greater role moving forward? Because that's always been, being an old Blue Dog guy myself, the closer the margin is to a 50-50 in the House, then you have that Tuesday group of moderate Republicans and that Blue Dog group that could start bringing policy back together. Do you think they'll play a part? Because I think what's ultimately happening is why you're having so many incumbents getting beat in primaries is the primary, the voters in the primary are to the extremes of both political parties, and you're not getting that more moderate member in those seats any longer.
Yes, it could be really interesting, and I would think that Democratic conference is going to be extremely interesting now that you've got even more candidates, because all 3 of those Democratic incumbent defeats were from the left. So you've got more on the AOC crowd likely in the next Democratic conference, and you could have, as you pointed out, more Blue Dogs too. So it could be some wild times, which you would know a lot better than me, inside those Democratic conference meetings as to what may happen. I see a question here on how many open seats there are. I believe the count is 48 right now on the open seat count in the House. Most of those, the overwhelming majority of those, are safe seats either way. So the open seats aren't going to play as big a role as they may normally with that high of a number.
Jim, let's talk about the calendar for a second. We have obviously a completely different election this year, a lot of mail-in ballots. Takes longer to count them in many cases. Some states are extending the deadlines. How on earth is that going to play out, and how long after Election Day might it be before we know who has won some of these races, including the presidency?
I think we're really headed for some real problems if the presidential election is close. And I'm not liking what I see in a lot of these states and the changes they've made in terms of election. There are 19 states now that are going to accept ballots after the election. And I think that's where we're going to get into some real trouble because they'll say, well, as long as it's postmarked by Election Day, then the ballot ought to count. But there's no real way they don't postmark anymore. It's a barcode. And so you don't really know when that person dropped it into the mail. They only know when they receive it. So of course we're going to have court challenges upon court challenges in these 19 states. And I think the biggest problems, again, we come back to North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. They're allowing votes to come in after the election. North Carolina, Pennsylvania are the Friday after the election, November 6th. Then we've got Michigan is going to be all the way to November 17th that they'll accept ballots coming into the county clerks. And some states then don't even start counting until they get all the ballots in, but depending upon their laws and procedures. Pennsylvania is the state I think that's gone the furthest, and I think we're going to have a lot of problems, and there's challenges already on this. If it comes down to Pennsylvania, and it very well may, I think we're going to be in real trouble because Pennsylvania, the state Supreme Court has already added drop boxes around the state where you can put your ballot in. I would think the chances of stuffing those things are a lot better than they are in a mailbox. But most particularly, I think the thing that's most concerning is the Secretary of State there in Pennsylvania has ruled that the county clerks may not verify a person's signature on an absentee ballot with their voter registration card. That's the key thing to do for verifiability. So what you're looking at there is an unverified election in Pennsylvania if that ruling stands. I'm not sure how the Secretary of State there would have the power to tell the county clerks how to verify their ballots, but apparently she's trying. That's being challenged. I think that's real problems. The model that the states, in my opinion, should use, but they're not, is the Oregon model. Oregon was the first state to go all mail. They did that back in 2000, so they've had 20 years now of elections on mail voting. And they make people get the ballot in on election day. So we've got 31 states that are requiring ballots in on election day. 19 ballots can come in after the election day. Oregon has had very few problems with this. The states we saw with big problems in the primaries, in New York, Kentucky, Maryland, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Nevada, they all are allowing elections or ballots to come in after the election. I think it's a serious problem for the reliability of the election, because we're going to see challenges and counter challenges to all sorts of ballots if the election's close. The Bloomberg news model, I think, was talking about, and I think they absolutely may be right, that President Trump is likely to win on election night in the in-person balloting, and Biden goes over the top with mail voting after the election. And then you look at these states that are accepting ballots after the election. I just think the chances of chaos after the election and an elongated post-election process is going to be bad, and I think it's not going to turn out well no matter who ends up winning.
So this question always has to be asked, but what happens, this is another little constitutional lesson, right, for our country as we've been having in elections from time to time. What happens, because this can happen, with a deadlocked electoral college, a tied electoral college? We know from our constitutional studies, our old classes, where it goes to the House of Representatives. But walk us through what happens then.
Well, and I think the chances of that are greater this time than in other elections. And we get back to what we just talked about with this post-election process and reception of ballots and the adjudication that's going to have to go through on all of these ballots. So if a state doesn't have a certified election by the time they have to send their electors to vote on December the 14th, then they can't vote. So if you have a couple of states in that situation that can't certify their election, they can't send a delegation to vote in the Electoral College, then we're going to go to a deadlock. And it goes to the House of Representatives. But Mike and Heath, as you know, when you were all there, you all had your own vote, but you wouldn't if you're voting for president. This is the one time that House members don't have their individual vote. Each state has one vote. And so here we got a situation where California, for example, with its 53 House members, they get one vote. And then the at-large states like Alaska and Montana and Wyoming and the Dakotas and Vermont and Delaware, they have one congressman. They get one vote too. So the vote for president actually skews to the small states and the rural area. And this was done on purpose by the founding fathers. And the reason that the Electoral College was created to make sure that the rural areas and the small population centers did not get overwhelmed by the larger population centers. That's why it was created. And it actually worked 240 years after they created it the way they designed it. They didn't want the big metropolitan areas, even in those days, to be able to fully control the election. And that is what we would have today. And it would totally change the presidential campaign.
So that would definitely skew in favor of President Trump.
At this point it would, but it is the new House and not the current House. The current House would have 26 Republican delegations, 22 Democratic delegations. Pennsylvania is split 9-9, and Michigan is they've got they're 8-6-1, I believe it is, or 7-7-1, and they've got one Libertarian member, Justin Amash. So, but he's not running again, so they will have a different delegation in this. So Michigan would be up in the air, but right now the Republicans would have 26. That's another reason to pay attention to the at-large states in the House races. So Montana and Alaska are both competitive, and if they're currently Republican, if they were to flip to the Democrats, not only would they gain a House seat, they would gain a vote for president if the Electoral College has to go to the House of Representatives.
Well, that is a crazy situation. I mean, from not knowing, there are certainly some states on election night or the days after election day that we won't know who won those states. Pennsylvania might be the prime example of that, with allowing ballots to come in.
And we could have a few. We could have several.
14 days.
Yeah, we could have several in that.
14 days after the election. And then, trying to figure out some of these Senate races, which might not be called by then. That one Georgia seat, if that goes to a runoff, that'll be January, which could impact or determine control of the Senate. It is going to be a wild election season, I guess we have to call it, not election day. But
yes.
This is.
And the other caveat if I could throw in this on the vote for president. Now, while the House votes for president, the Senate votes for vice president. And the Senate, each senator does have his or her own vote for vice president. So you could be in a situation, but again, what you were just talking about, maybe not if all the Senate races aren't done, but you could have a vice president elected without the president being elected. So if that dragged on past January 20th, then the vice president would become acting president until the presidential race was solved.
And let me throw one last question at you, because we did get some questions as we've tried to address them during the course of this program. I know we talked about the Supreme Court, who might end up having a role determining certain ballots, if they count or if they don't count, if these legal challenges work their way up to the Supreme Court. That's one of the reasons, I guess, why this most recent nominee, Judge Barrett, could have an impact on all of this as well. Do you expect this to be played out over the Senate hearings in her confirmation process?
Well, I think it will definitely tell us that the vote will occur before the election for that very reason. And it's extremely important for this, because when you talk about these challenges in the states to their final vote count, eventually it's going to end up into the Supreme Court. And that's probably the only arbiter. As we remember, we went back to 2000 with Bush and Gore in Florida. That did end up in the U.S. Supreme Court. I think we would see that again. And so therefore, that Supreme Court vacancy becomes even more important, because a lot of Republicans believe they can't count on John Roberts' vote for Trump, and it could be the deciding factor. So it's a big deal. And I noticed one question too is what happens back on the other, if the if the House of Representatives vote for the president ties at 25 states apiece, and that could happen. Well, then the scenario where the vice president becomes the acting president would take effect until they arrived at a majority in the U.S. House.
Well, that is a whole host of crazy circumstances that I think most of us are hoping we do not have to live through that civics lesson. I think we're probably most of us are very happy to read about that in theory, but would prefer not to live through that
In theory,
process.
yes.
Well, this has been
we
a
are headed.
fantastic.
I think we already have enough crazy times in 2020. I mean, we could still see many, many more.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, it's been a pretty wild year for all of us already, and it would be nice if the election provided less drama rather than more. So we'll all keep our fingers crossed on that front. But this has been a fantastic discussion. A lot of key races: the White House, the Congress. I know I learned a few things here, and I hope our listeners, Heath, I hope our listeners gain some clarity here as well and help us to understand and maybe be better observers over these next 6 weeks as these campaigns work their way through toward Election Day. I want to offer a special thanks to Jim Ellis. Jim, thanks for joining us again. It's always great to be with you and really appreciate your time today.
Well, thanks so much, and I sure enjoyed being invited and being able to participate again.
Well, Heath, I think we just need to strap in on our seatbelts here for the next 35 days. It's going to be it's already a pretty charged atmosphere. We have a lot of partisan campaigns battling back and forth. I think it's probably going to be taken into another gear as beginning tonight with the first presidential debate tonight. I know I'm going to be watching closely, Heath, and it's always a pleasure to be on these programs and to host these with you, my friend.
Mike, it's always wonderful. And Jim, outstanding job, great insight. Always enjoy this program with you. And as 2020 has proven itself to be a very crazy year, I think it's going to be evident in the upcoming next 35 days or even longer, as we've learned today, that this presidential race can be.
Well, on behalf of this bipartisan Baker Hostetler team, we thank you for joining us and thank you for being on this webinar, and good afternoon from our nation's capital.